super excited to have you here tonight, and we're going to have a reading by Terese Svoboda, who is the author of 7 collections of poetry, 6 novels, a novella and stories, a memoir, a biography, and a book of translation. Her essays, reviews, fiction, poetry have appeared in numerous publications, including Granta, the New Yorker, and the Paris Review. She's won a Guggenehim, the Iowa Prize for Poetry, an Eyewear for Translation, the Graywolf Nonfiction Prize, a Jerome Foundation Prize for Video, the O. Henry Award for the short story, and a Pushcart Prize for the essay. So everything. She's also a 3-time winner of the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship and has been awarded James Merrill, Yaddo, MacDowell, and Bellagio residencies. And her opera Wet premiered at LA's Disney Hall in 2005. Welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so glad you're here to listen. I happen to have in the audience my extended family, whom I owe a lot to. Who would imagine that you could fall in love with your in-laws? That's crazy. But my 101-year-old uncle is here today as a witness to my reading. Thank you. So I have one Texas joke so far, in which I was getting off the airplane yesterday, and getting on the airplane, this woman came on and she said, we're going to have such a terrible storm in Houston, which I think is here too, that the hail is going to be as big as baseballs. And that wasn't enough. Someone in the back said, as basketballs. That's so Texas, don't you think? So this is called the Great American Desert, which is an appellation. It was put on the region of an 8-state area in the Midwest by Major Long, who was kind of a sour character as an explorer. And it just happens to be also almost the same area that the Ogallala Aquifer is part of. So when I put this, which is one of the largest places where water is stored underground in the world, and is the reason why we have the breadbasket of America that is being, in one of my stories, revealed as poisoned and so forth, in various other ways transformed. So the structure of this book begins with the Clovis people who, but with the Clovis people of prehistoric time, and then it goes into the future, sci-fi. And then when I put the stories together, I discovered that there was water trickling through all of it. And so it has earned its way into a new genre called cli-fi. So it has cli-fi, sci-fi. And I'll read you the beginning of a love story, which I have never really written a love story before, regardless of what anyone else thinks. This one is situated in South Dakota, where there was something called the Black Hills Army Depot, and it was a place that bombs were reconditioned and then sent back to the front during World War II. But it doesn't get dark at the very beginning. It's a love story, after all. The stub of a town kicks up its legs, puts on an actual parade for those who'll decide which town gets the bomb works, her daddy being one of the deciders, a tall, heavy-nosed state politician who looks good in a suit when others don't. His wife comes along for the parade, and their daughter hands out flyers coincident with the next election. Hump takes 2. The other guys keep their hands in their pockets once they thank you, ma'am, her. Hump doesn't even look at the flyer before he wants another. Known as Hump to his face, a face that looks enough like John Wayne's that some people think he ought to get a rope and start in with a lariat, if not a horse. He is not as shy as he could be, since you don't get to be 18 looking like that without some serious experience. Nearby, a Mary Beth is trying to wound him grievously by flirting with the boy in this grievously by flirting with the boy from the next town, a Colette, who slinks around in a long dress in this 95-degree parade weather in the middle of a float that reads, "We're ready if you are," and a Nancy who wears nothing under her band jacket just in case. He pockets those flyers without looking at them because he is looking at the politician's daughter. Vote Walker, she yells. He'll give you what you want. Vote Walker, you won't regret it. She stands dark-eyed, dark-haired, red-lipped and tall. Chewing gum, he asks when she takes a breath. He holds up a stick to her face, hoping to quiet her. Kind of you, she says, taking it and unwrapping it. She pops it into her mouth and shouts, Vote Walker. I thought you might be getting hoarse. He sidles himself up a little closer. He is wide through the chest and thin at the waist. He can get close. She chews, she nods. He extracts his flyers from his pocket and waves them at her, shouting, Vote Walker. At the end of the parade that turns out short, due to the size of the town and not its enthusiasm, her father struts over the way a politician will, handshaking Hump with his right hand and working the boy's shoulder muscle with his left. We'll get the bomb works built here in no time, son. Don't you worry about that, as long as the vote goes my way. I think you have a chance, says Hump, at least here. We don't get many running for the big offices that come around here. Oh, I'm partial to the will of the people on this issue, says the politician, his hand moving to the back of his daughter's neck as if he is about to herd her from Hump. He goes on, despite constituents beelining for him. Not just the capitals. When people anywhere talk, I give a listen. With the war on, a bomb plant is just what you need out here. Why, you could be a bomb jockey. The politician pretends to gallop. The one-armed photographer from the paper takes a picture of the three of them. Just imagine this whole place lit up with new enterprise, the photographer says. His buggy, black bean-like eyes are lit up with his camera flash. I'll do my best, says the politician, as if he will, looking around for his wife, who is caught up in a swirl of voters. Say, he says to this cowboy standing too close to his daughter, why aren't you signed up to fight? Soul support, he says, a crippled mother. He gives the girl a sidelong look. She is watching the parade watchers fold their chairs. I'm sorry to hear that, says the politician with a nod of suspicion. This kid with his handsomeness, with his thumbs hooked to his belt loops and enough of a grin to signal he can take whatever he gets, nods back. Help my girls pack the rest of the flyers out to my car, why don't you, says the politician. He gestures toward the bale of flyers behind her. Show him where, he says to his daughter. Hump hauls the bale. He isn't giving her the where-to look most men, he imagines, gives her in the pretty big town she comes from. He is taking his time so she can inspect him, a specimen she could not have had much recent experience with. Nearly all the able-bodied have flocked to the draft. He looks very able-bodied. She leads him through the waist-high weeds into the lot her mother parked the car beside. Are you a religious nut, she asks. Is that really why you haven't been drafted? You have no manners, he says, and then raises the bale of flyers with one finger over her head, as if she should now take them from him. My ankle, she screeches, turning her heel on a weed. Ouch, she says, and drops herself suddenly, but not too violently, to the ground. That hurt, she mused. Miss Walker, he says. Miss? He drops the bundle of flyers to the ground and bends over to check the damage. She catches him by the neck and pulls him to her so far down that the weeds hide them both. Now I am both a girl of virtue and my father's daughter, but here, she kisses him on the cheek, you can kiss me back. I can do better than that, he says, and puckers right up on her mouth and passes his gum to her. She spits it out. You idiot. Pretty low, he says, falling like that. He walks out without the flyers. It's a bad start, but it's much more interesting. And so I've been asked to read also from a book that came out in paper last year called Anything That Burns You, a portrait of Lola Ridge, a radical poet. I happened upon a piece written by Robert Pinsky, who was our poet laureate a couple of times, on the internet, on his column for Slate. And he described this woman as a woman who wrote poetry about New York City around the teens of the 1910 to 1920, and quoted none of the poems that I thought were really fabulous after I was seduced into writing her biography. Look at all these pages, it's ridiculous. And so 4 years into the research, I looked at the comments section at that, trying to figure out why I did it. And aside from the fact that she lived very close to where I live now in New York, on the Lower East Side, there wasn't anything in that article that I really could see. But then I looked at that, my comments were full of exclamation marks and excitement. So all I can say is, you know, she made me do it. The biography begins with a quote from Catherine Ann Porter, who was a famous short story writer, but at the time she was making a living as a journalist, and she was covering the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti in Boston in around 1927. So I'm beginning with a quote from her. One tall, thin figure of a woman stepped out alone, a good distance into the empty square. And when the police came down at her, and the horse's hooves bent over her head, she did not move, but stood with her shoulders slightly bowed, entirely still. The charge was repeated again and again, but she was not to be driven away. A man near me said in horror, suddenly recognizing her, "That's Lola Ridge." In 1927, Lola Ridge was known to a huge public, primarily as the author of The Ghetto and Other Poems, a book that portrayed the immigrant as human, struggling, yes, but with hopes for the future. Sacco and Vanzetti were two such immigrants, about to be executed for crimes they most likely did not commit. Ridge, too, was an immigrant, having traveled across the Pacific from New Zealand. Her presence at the demonstration was announced in advance on the front page of major newspapers as an important witness to the event, sort of like it is now. Oh, well, too many poets in the audience. She was also an anarchist when anarchy was a political possibility, especially among intellectuals and artists, and immigrants, those who had left their home country to pursue the dream of freedom in the country that promised it. Ridge was one of the first to delineate the life of the poor in Manhattan, and in particular women's lives in New York City. The title poem of her second book, Sun Up and Other Poems, is a striking modernist depiction of a bad girl's interior life. And I will quote to you a poem from that book. The speaker is, I would say she was a little girl between 7 and 9, and if any of you have ever had mistreated Barbies, you will understand. I beat Janie and beat her, but still she smiled. So I scratched her between the eyes with a pin. Now she doesn't love me anymore. She scowls and scowls, though I begged her to forgive me and poured sugar in the hole at the back of her head. That's my favorite book. Harriet Monroe, founder of Poetry magazine, and William Rose Benet, founder of the Saturday Review of Literature, called Ridge a genius. 4 years before T.S. Eliot's bleak and anti-Semitic The Wasteland, her equally long poem, The Ghetto, celebrated the otherness of the Jewish Lower East Side and prophesied the multi-ethnic world of the 21st century. And here I'll quote a very short poem that she wrote around 1911, when there was a huge influx of immigrants, but so many that they were sleeping on the park benches everywhere. You can see photographs of them with their straw boaters over their eyes. Debris. I love those spirits that men stand off and point at. or shudder and hood up their souls, those ruined ones, where liberty has lodged an hour and passed like flame, bursting asunder the too small house. At the end of the teens and the early 1920s, when Ridge was one of the editors of Others and then Broom magazine, two famous modernist magazines, she presided over Thursday afternoon salons filled with modernist hotshots, eating slices of Ridge's cake and drinking whatever prohibition would allow, and not. William Carlos Williams and Robert McGowan hatched plans for their magazine Contact. 20-year-old Hart Crane flirted with everyone in sight. Marianne Moore read early drafts of her own work, and Mayakovsky stomped on her coffee table. In 1919, Ridge gave a speech in Chicago entitled Woman and the Creative Will, about how sexually constructed gender roles hinder female development. This was 10 years before Virginia Woolf wrote A Room of One's Own. Woman is not, and never has been, man's natural inferior, Ridge announced. Although she wrote little personal poetry, Ridge advocated individual liberty. She supported not only the rights of women, but laborers, blacks, Jews, immigrants, and homosexuals. She wrote about lynchings, executions, race riots, and imprisonments. As a rebellious lefty, she interacted closely with the most radical women of her era, from editing Margaret Sanger's magazine on birth control in 1918 to reciting her own poems at Emma Goldman's deportation dinner. Back then, if you were deported, you had a big dinner. But eventually, she was arrested during a demonstration against the execution of Sakwan Vanzetti and hauled off with Ed to St. Vincent Millay. In 1936, watching a May Day parade in Mexico City, she raised her fist in solidarity with the marching communists. So despite the praise she received in her obituary in the New York Times in 1941, which described her as one of the leading poets of America, few have heard of her today. She died at the nadir of leftist politics, just as the US was entering World War II. By then, Eliot and Pound had very effectively equated elitism with good in poetry. You would think, of course, that in the 60s, they who rediscovered feminism and anarchy would have resurrected her. Not quite. Her work appears in two important anthologies, and her life as an anarchist, and then you would imagine that her life as an anarchist should have had great appeal to the revolutionary spirit of the time. But the feminist critic Louise Bernekow singled out Ridge and Genevieve Taggart as twice neglected because they were women and radicals, part of the buried history within the buried history. Although poetry has always addressed society's problems and recorded its cultural and political history, whatever its formal precepts, society has not always wanted to hear about these subjects. So what has been lost by these omissions is the radical and political tradition of 20th century American poetry and the idea that these subjects are even appropriate for poetry. An entire generation and tradition was essentially amputated from literary consciousness. Today, as you know, the same neo-fascist threat that Ridge experienced in the earliest years of the century through the Red Scare and the deportation of thousands of immigrants, including Emma Goldman, that appeals to Americans and Europeans who are now in search of order and conformity. So I'll read to you one more poem of hers at the end of the book. Many things happened in her life. She was a true anarchist. She did all kinds of things, begged her way from New York to Baghdad because she wanted to write a poem about the origin of civilization. One check at a time from her patrons. She was like Isadora Duncan. She expected that her art should be supported. And she took a lover when she was 61 on a Guggenehim in Mexico, and did quite a few other amazing things with her time. Ridge saw very clearly where freedom's repression could lead. Her brilliant situation captures the way democracy deals finally with its people. Electrocution. He shudders feeling on the shaved spot the probing wind that stabs him to a thought of storm-drenched fields in a white foam of light, and roads of his hill town that leap to sight like threads of tortured silver, while the guards, monstrous death dolls that move as on a string, in wanted haste to finish with this thing, turn faces blanker than asphalted yards. They heard the shriek that tore out of its sheath, but as a feeble moan, yet dared not breathe, who stared there at him, arching like a tree, when the winds wrench it, and the earth holds tight, whose soul, expanding in white agony, had fused in flaming circuit with the night. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I will try to answer the questions about either book. Flashing them. Yes.
Yeah, Terese, I think you are known for your brevity, and yet you've written a big biography of this wonderful poet. How was your process different, writing a biography versus your prose or your poetry?
Well, deciding the length of something, the rules of engagement begin really very early on in the experience. When you, in her case, I could see I wanted to make a life that had to be reflected in context because no one had heard of her. So you had to see how she interacted with the people of her era, which meant that I had to explain who these people were as well as her role in their lives. So in putting together the first few chapters, you kind of, you get the texture of the whole book that way. And you have to continue with the same kind of details throughout. And I'll have to admit that I was really delighted when she died. That was meant I only had one more chapter to write. But that's a very good question because the texture of a piece, they say in poetry, it's the first line that sets the rules for the rest of the work. And in a short story, it's the first line of the story. And in the case of a biography, you know, you have, when you've done enough research, you suddenly realize that you don't want to bore people. I mean, look at all these pages. Oh, but there, about that much is footnotes. And you know, you've probably all read biographies where you have to listen to how much they had for breakfast, and that's not the intent. But in order to convey their place in history, you really have to establish a rhythm and a pace so that you can get all the material across. Thank you. Yes.
So at the beginning you talked about how you fell in love with this person, and you're not exactly sure how that happened when you went and you looked back at your that blog posting that you put. So what was the arc of your relationship with her throughout the course of your writing?
Well, I think that's an interesting question because, and almost every biographer is asked that, because the initial attraction is kind of like upon meeting someone at a party. They're very, you know, there's something about them that is irresistible. And so, but the more you find out, you know, about the complexity of someone, and you're really digging into, you see the whole person from birth to death, that there's a possibility of falling out of love. And I know I did a lot of research into a book about Ben Franklin, and I decided I didn't like his relationship with his wife. It just didn't like it. And I did talk to Stacy Shipp, who then did write a biography of Ben, and she said that that was a part of her too. And Lola, she did one difficult thing in her life, which is when she decided to emigrate from New Zealand to America. She was about 32 years old, and she had a child who was I think, 8 years old. And she could have left him with the father and his extended family in New Zealand, but she took him along. There's nothing wrong with that, but somewhere along the voyage, she decided that he was going to an orphanage because she could see that she couldn't do her art taking care of him. And she was penniless. She knew no one, as far as I know, when she arrived in San Francisco. So she left him in an orphanage in Los Angeles, and she did not retrieve him. At the age of 14, when they let everyone out of orphanages then, who were supposed to make your way into the world, they reunited in New Orleans, and then they lived together with her new boyfriend in Detroit for 4 years, and she never saw him again after that. So I think that's the reason why the executor, who had her papers for so long, never wrote her biography, because that was just kind of too hard to understand. So in my biography, I make a case contextually what women had to do from the Victorian era, which had so emphasized families, to break free and be able to work in the world of art. And they did all kinds of very drastic things. So in contextualizing that, it makes her decision more understandable. Not even today, of course, we don't find that it's still reprehensible today. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So I did find until I had contextualized it for myself enough, difficult to be happy with her. And she wasn't a very likable person. She was an anarchist who really believed in her own freedom. And that didn't mean she trampled on other people's lives, but she was a fierce flame of her belief in herself and also in poetry. William Carlos Williams called her the Vestal of poetry. I mean, people acknowledged the fact that she was totally dedicated. And if you know anyone who's totally dedicated to something, they're a little hard to take after a while. That's all they want to talk about, whatever. But by the time I got to the end of her life, I was more sympathetic, and you understand more about the kinds of decisions she had to make.
So I'm sorry to trouble you with a follow-up question.
All right, I have another question. Yes.
Okay.
Let me take your question.
I have a question about her having access to her papers. Her
Yes.
estate obviously gave you permission to work with her papers?
The papers were held at Smith College.
Okay, so you accessed them through their collection?
Well, the executor, 40 years earlier, had made a deal with her husband, that second husband. She was a bigamist. Actually, a lot of people in Edwardian years were bigamists. They just took the first boat, went on with their lives. She made a deal with the husband that she would take half of the material and keep it at her place while she worked on the biography, but she never wrote the biography. So I've never seen half of the material. But I think over the years, in order to impress people and to keep interest in Lola alive at all, she would let little tidbits out. For example, a couple of letters to Emma Goldman and so forth. And I think I have the majority of the material, but she has never contacted me after I published this to say that I was all wrong. And she did have the luxury of interviewing people who were alive at the time, which of course I didn't have. So maybe that's what she's got, But the reason why Smith, they don't even have copies of this material. The reason why they wouldn't press her for it is because she raises money for the college.
For what?
For the college, for Smith.
Of course. Can I ask another question about how much of her upbringing in New Zealand is reflected in her works?
Well, the second book, the one written in the voice of a little girl, is Australasian. In other words, it's kind of based in Australia and New Zealand kind of melded together. And she always intended to write a sequel to that, but she never got around to it. So that in particular is based on that. Her first book, The Ghetto and Other Poems, is very New York. And of course, you could probably trace something through all of her work, but it's mostly the second book. Yes?
Okay, so as a follow-up to the earlier question, so there's some controversy today about whether artists, their work should be looked at in as of itself, even though the artist themselves was a terrible individual. So she doesn't quite fall into that category, but because she was difficult. Do you have any thoughts, or what are your thoughts about that argument today, where the art should sort of stand at one side separate from the character who...
Well, that's a complicated question.
Yes.
And it is the question with Ezra Pound, of course. He was tried for treason, and yet he won a major American prize, and was highly thought of, still to some extent. I don't have an opinion about that, really, actually. I think you have to read the work, and the work, it was seen in the light of an anarchist who really believed in I'm talking about anarchy as defined by the Russians in the late 19th century, Kropotkin and so forth, which is a very humanistic point of view. The people need to take responsibility for their own lives. So she did. She took responsibility for some of it. So I don't really have an answer for that. She didn't kill anybody, and it's complicated. The things that women had to do in order to do what they felt was most important. Yes.
This is another process question, going back to what you're talking about, the texture of that first chapter.
Yes.
What was the process like getting to that point, having moved through so much texture of the research itself and of the papers, when you're looking at balancing the work in, juxtaposed with your words and what you're willing to, show us as the reader, that's her voice, what's your voice? What was that process like, both in terms of time and its ability to reveal itself?
So are you asking me, when should you start writing after all the research?
Yes, I guess.
Okay, I can answer that. Well, kind of when the burden of the story begins, I actually start really right away because I want to write down the things that I get excited about, and then fill in backwards as you find out more things. You keep filling back, and hope that you don't find out really book-changing pieces of information. I know Deidre Blair was writing the biography of Samuel Beckett, and she was ready to turn in the galleys when they discovered a letter written by Samuel Beckett about his mother, and she had always assumed from everything else that he adored his mother. No. So she had to rewrite the book. So that doesn't usually happen, but the light changes as you find out new things. But after a while, you begin to be smothered by research, and the whole project feels like you can't go forward. And that's really, you have to start writing then. Just kind of write your way out of it. Also, writing a biography or doing translations is always very, for me anyway, I feel smothered after a while because I can't get back to my own work. So that's a challenge too. Then you have to battle your way out of the paper bag that you made for yourself. Thank you, everyone.